Good morning, class, and welcome to this week's edition of Sunday School Snippets. My name is Brigid and I'm here today with our special guest, Deanna Williston. Deanna is a fellow SJCC parishioner, a former homeschool mom, a Catholic vlogger, and a member of the Secular Franciscan Order, and that's just a few of the things that she does, so we're very happy to have her today. First of all, welcome, Deanna. Thank you for being here. Can you tell us, first off, what a secular Franciscan is for those of our listeners who might not know?
Okay, well, the Franciscan family is unique among the families in the Catholic world because St. Francis actually founded all three of the main orders. The first order has your friars in it, your friars minor conventional, and the Capuchins. The second order is the nuns, the poor clares who spend their time in adoration in a cloister. And the third order is the secular order, which was started out when a married couple came to St. Francis, that they wanted to follow Jesus in his footsteps, but they wanted to stay married. They didn't want to be a friar or a nun. And so he created the third order for them, for married people, people in the secular world. And then the funny thing happened that some of them living in community ended up wanting to go back and live in a cloister or a friary, so they became like the third order regulars from Steubenville. A lot of people know them, and so they're in the third order, but those are actually priests and brothers. And then there's many orders of third order sisters, and that's why we don't call ourselves third order Franciscans anymore, because it's confusing. So we go by the name Secular Franciscans, even though we're really third order.
That definitely clarifies, because I was a little fuzzy on what a secular Franciscan is, even after you became one.
Yeah, so we're canonically established. We're the only third order that is that way. And so we get together monthly and we have formation and fraternity. We normally have lunch together. We do, like I said, we do some kind of formation, and we have a number of different charitable projects that we do as well.
Okay, well, there you go. That's secular Franciscan in a nutshell. But today, actually, Deanna is going to tell us about John Bradburne, who is a Catholic missionary who may one day be canonized a saint, hopefully. So can you tell us a little bit about him? How did you stumble across John Bradburne?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show, if I hadn't said that yet. I stumbled on John Bradburne when I did research for a secular Franciscan charity project in Africa. It's called Well for Africa. It's pretty self-explanatory there. So the current site is in Matemwa, Zimbabwe, and it included a photo of a long-haired, long-bearded Englishman. So it seemed like an odd person to be living in Matemwa, and I was like, what is it with that picture? And I'm pretty curious, so it probably didn't take much for me to start really doing research, and I quickly found out a couple of things. I know nothing about Zimbabwe or its history or people, and that John Bradburne's cause for sainthood had actually recently been opened by the Vatican, and I was hooked.
Yeah, knowing you, I'm sure you jumped straight into research mode. So what did you find on John Bradburne?
Well, he was born almost 100 years ago. In fact, next year is going to be the centenary of his birth. John Bradburne lived in a curious life. He was always searching for ways that God could use his talents. So where John grew up in England, he had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and he, and especially his sisters, enjoyed music and poetry. And he had thought that he'd go to university for literature, but World War II intervened, and he became a British officer with the Indian Army. So he spent a lot of time in the jungles of both India and Burma. And while he was in Burma, he had a vision of Our Lady that just completely changed the direction of his life. And he really tried to figure out how Mary could use him to save others. You could tell he really wasn't meant to be a soldier. In Burma, he probably spent as much time looking at the birds and the wildlife and the trees as he did anything else while he was waiting for the battle. So then he tried, okay, he's not made to be a soldier, maybe he could be a monk, and that didn't work out. So he even one time walked barefoot, I think, to the Holy Land or to Rome.
Oh my goodness.
He usually didn't even have money on these trips, and he was just such a kind man, and you could see that his heart was really for God, and so people would help him along his journey. And so that's how he traveled the world. He would try out various forms of life, and nothing succeeded. Even when he ended up in a mission house in Africa, he was still pretty restless. He knew he needed something a little bit more isolated so he could focus on God. And one day a friend asked John to accompany her to visit a home for sick foreigners. When John went, nobody realized how much it impacted him, but he immediately went back to the retreat house. He packed his things and just left. He was going to Metemwa. So that's where he spent the rest of his life, serving the poor and disfigured lepers at Metemwa. And a lot of people think leprosy is completely eradicated. It kind of is and isn't. If it's caught right away, it's totally treatable. But you can imagine if you're living in a third world country, you may not have the best access to that preventative care. Plus, because of the history of Zimbabwe, these poor people didn't really have access to medical services. They were in very rural locations. And these were actually out-of-country workers. You know, they were coming into the country to work for a season, and then they'd go home or send the money home. Once they got leprosy, they weren't allowed to leave the country to go home. Their countries wouldn't let them. So this was a place of foreigners who were sick and disfigured and very much unwanted. And when the Civil War came, because at the time Zimbabwe was called Rhodesia, and that Civil War came, John he refused to leave them. Everybody were like, you're a white man, you need to leave the country. And he just wouldn't. And the soldiers could not believe that a white Englishman would genuinely love the poor black African lepers. They thought that like his recording equipment, it was like a little cassette player. They thought that that was like somehow a spy radio or something. So they came after him. And now we're at nearly 100 years after John's birth. And he had died in 1979. And the church has just recently opened his cause for sainthood because of his martyrdom. Now, will he be declared a saint? We don't know, but the good work continues at Metemwa in his name. And as well, he's a poet, and the poetry he wrote keeps drawing people to Christ.
Wow. He definitely was very multi-talented, and he sounds very like a countercultural in a good sense, though.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. And as an added fun fact, Deanna's Halloween costume this year was actually inspired by John Bradburne.
Yeah, during his time working with the lepers in Africa in the 1970s, John grew out his hair and beard, and to tame that wild mane of hair, he would often wear a big red headband, like you might see a basketball or volleyball player wearing. And that was pretty much my whole Halloween costume, the classic John Bradburne red headband. And once I posted a photo of me in my costume on Facebook, everybody started trying to guess who I was dressed as. So I kept doing little clues and teasers to see if people could guess. And in that way, I got to share a lot of John's story with people.
Yeah, you had me fooled there for a while, too. And didn't your costume also have a kid's musical instrument? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, John's favorite composer was Bach. And one of his favorite pieces was the great Fantasia and Fugue in G minor. Some people call it the Alleluia Fugue. You wouldn't think that people would play classical music on a recorder, but that's what John did. And after World War II, between when he was trying to be a monk in various orders, John played classical music on his recorder on the street. You know, like you might see some people by the subway with an open guitar case or whatever, and you throw money in. So he actually was using his tips to help restore an old Anglican church that was falling down. And a lot of people were like, but it's an Anglican church and you're Catholic. Why are you doing that? And he was praying that the entire Anglican church and all the parishioners would one day rejoin the Catholic Church. John also spent time singing in a church choir. He lived in a bell loft, like wherever he could during that little transitory time. And in Metemwa, he still played the recorder because it's super easy to travel with. But somebody also gave him a harmonium, which is like a tiny little freestanding organ. And it's pretty common in India, so I think that's where he was introduced to it. But so he could play along to Mass and all kinds of stuff on that little harmonium.
Neat. Yeah, the only African instrument that I'm familiar with is like a little thumb piano. I forget what the actual name for it is called, but he definitely was a character, to say the least.
Yeah, John had such a funny sense of humor. You might call it like the British dry wit. It's also in his poetry. And it's kind of a funny fact that you'd think somebody working with lepers and all wouldn't be the most prolific poet in the English language. He's in the Guinness World Book of Records. He's written about twice as many lines of poetry as Shakespeare.
No way.
It's mind-blowing. And his poetry has several main themes. Over half the poems are about Mary and the Trinity, but he also wrote about the Bible, Old and New Testament, nature, travel, the other cultures he'd encountered, Shakespeare, and Africa. Some of his poetry is considered very highfalutin, but much of it is easy for the average person to enjoy. And that's one of the really unusual things. And he wrote perfectly in meter, and he just didn't make corrections. It was perfect from the get-go. One of his famous poems is even set to the great fugue in G minor. You can play the music while you read his poetry, and it's perfectly synced. Of course, being John, though, his sense of humor comes through because one of his most famous poems is about false teeth. I like that he didn't take himself too seriously. You often think that saints have to be boring or not have much of a sense of humor, but John shows us that it's possible to be a normal person and be a saint.
John was so good at so many things. I bet his family must have been very proud of him.
John's dad was an Anglican pastor, so he was not happy when John joined the Catholic Church, but they did make up before his dad's death. John was always close, however, to his siblings, and at least one of his sisters also ended up in Africa. And today his nieces and great-nieces run the John Bradburne Memorial Society. John he had seen the Jewish people as his brothers and sisters, and he longed to bring them to Christ. That was one of his big missions. He just couldn't figure out how to do it, and it frustrated him, but he would always try again differently. I find that pretty inspiring, too. Maybe one day his poetry will reach across theological divides and help more people to get to know Jesus. This is one of the many ways that John was like St. Francis of Assisi. He was also a secular Franciscan, just like me, and he tried to bring people together as a Christian family. To John, skin color, religion, nationality, health, money, those things just didn't matter. What mattered is that Jesus Christ came among us and he died for us so that we might all be his adopted brothers and sisters. This love of man for God's sake is what drew John to the lepers. When he first visited him, remember how I said he immediately went and packed his bags and went to live with them? It's because when he got there, they immediately ran to their rooms, those that could run. They might have shuffled some of them, and they put burlap sacks over their heads because they thought they were too ugly for a white man to see. And they were wearing numbers around their necks instead of having names. They were given such basic food because since they were foreigners and sick, people didn't want them to have better than the poor people of the actual country. And John wouldn't accept that. He loved them. They were his very own brothers and sisters. He learned their names. He celebrated all their talents and triumphs. He even wrote a poem celebrating each member of his new family at Metemwa. Every year, there's a big celebratory mass that the people still throw in John's honor, and people come from around the world to attend. This year, it was much smaller, but they did live stream the mass from Zimbabwe. At the time, I had only just found John, so I was so excited, and I really wanted to see the mass, but our time would be 4 a.m. for the mass because Zimbabwe, being in Africa, is super ahead of us time-wise, and I'm not a morning person, and I could not imagine getting up at 4 a.m. for mass. But God is so mighty, he blessed me with shingles right around that time. Shingles is like chicken pox for old people. At 48, I was a little young to get this painful virus, but there I was, in a lot of pain and unable to sleep. I also had to set an alarm to take my medicine, and one of the times I needed to take the medicine was 4 a.m.
That's perfect timing right there.
I was so amazed, and so I had no excuse not to get up at 4 a.m. So I just got up in my jammies and went and turned on the live stream. And I was in horrific pain still, but there I was watching this beautiful mass full of people singing and dancing and praising God. After the mass, I fell asleep. When I woke up, my pain was gone. And not just lessened, it was completely gone. I was so grateful. I vowed to do what I could to tell people about John and his way of letting God use even your littlest talents.
Amen. Yeah, John sure had an unusual lifestyle, but inspiring at the same time. What can we learn from John Bradburne's example?
John's wish was that we could all see our worth in God. His story is that God will not only seek the lost, he will use any little talents we have, and that everyone is family. Today, while we hope that John will be declared a saint by the church officially, we're still thankful that his work is still being done at Metemwa and with John's poetry. Anybody interested in learning more or joining our efforts could reach out to me personally. Check out my YouTube channel or go to www.johnbradburne, and that's JohnBradburne.com, or www.johnbradburnepoems.com.
Awesome. So that's the story of John Bradburne. Thank you so much, Deanna, for being here and sharing more info about this cause with our listeners. I know you're very passionate about it, and I certainly hope that John is canonized one day. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to Sunday School Snippets. I just want to add in here real quick, if you want to hear more from Deanna Williston, As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, she does have her own YouTube vlog called Our Blooming Catholic Life. And again, this can be found on YouTube. Just search Deanna Williston OFS. Search that in YouTube and subscribe to her channel for some great videos, reflections on Catholic resources, Catholic books, all from a secular Franciscan point of view. And who knows, maybe it could be a good Advent resource if you haven't found one that suits you yet. Thanks again for joining us, and have a blessed Sunday.